Some of you didn't just walk in here this morning. You brought something along with you. I'm not talking about your kids, not talking about that relative that shows up on Easter. I'm talking about something no one else can see, something that feels finished, a part of your life that feels like it's already been sealed shut. And do you know what that does? It puts you in a place where you're still going through the motions, but inside it feels like you're standing in a cemetery. That's exactly where our story begins this morning, not with a celebration, but with a sealed tomb, not with hope, but with finality. So before we come to Easter this morning, to the resurrection, I want to take you back to the moment when Jesus was placed in the tomb. Because you cannot understand the power of the resurrection until you've first felt the finality of his death. After Jesus died but still was hanging on the cross, Luke tells us, now there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea. He was a member of the council, a good and righteous man who had not consented to their decision and action and was looking for the kingdom of God. Matthew gives us a couple extra details. He says, when it was evening, there came a man from Arimathea named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus. Luke, along with the other gospel writers, want us to know that this isn't merely a legend or myth. This is history. A real, identifiable man, Joseph, steps forward here to care for the body of Jesus. Luke says, this man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud and laid him in a tomb cut in stone where no one else had been laid. Matthew says it was his own tomb. See, for Joseph not to only be rich, but also a member of the Sanhedrin, he had a lot to risk by stepping forward. The very council that had condemned Jesus had ruled that anyone associated with him would be put out of the synagogue. And that's no small thing, friends. To be put out of the synagogue wasn't just about losing a place to worship. It meant that you were cut off from the very center of community life. It meant social isolation. It meant economic loss. It meant that your relationships, your reputation, even your livelihood could suffer. Joseph was a follower of Jesus. There's going to come a point in your life that following Jesus costs you something. And some of you here today know exactly what that feels like. Joseph had a position. He had a reputation. He had something to lose, and yet he steps forward anyway. He steps forward and he does it publicly. Joseph steps forward to ensure that Jesus receives a respectful burial, not the kind that criminals would receive, whose bodies would just be thrown out for the birds to eat, because to him, Jesus is not just another condemned man. And what follows is a burial that is both public and secure. Matthew tells us that after the body was laid inside the tomb, a large stone was rolled across the entrance. He says, and a large stone to the tomb. He rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. In Joseph's world, in their world, that stone signaled finality, just like closing a casket at a funeral does in ours. When the lid is shut, that's when reality sets in. That's when the real grieving begins. No one expects that casket to open up again. So here we are, the sun setting Friday afternoon. Jesus is laid in the tomb, stones rolled into place, and it all feels final. And it all happens quickly. This is a hurried burial. And Luke tells us why. He says it was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. See, from sunset Friday night to sunset Saturday, life basically came to a stop. The Jewish people would set their work aside, and they honored that day as holy. So once the Sabbath began, everything paused. The burial was incomplete. The grief of Jesus' followers had to wait then a whole day until early Sunday morning. Luke says, the women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how the body was laid. These women are watching it all unfold. They see the exact location. They see exactly how the body was laid. There's no confusion here. So when they return Sunday morning, they're not mistaken about which tomb they're visiting. That's one of the big things that the skeptics highlight. They go to the wrong tomb. Then we read, Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. They returned from the tomb to their homes, prepared the ointments. On the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment. Those spices tell us something about their expectation. These women aren't anticipating a miracle. They're preparing for decay, because as far as they know, the story's over. And that's exactly where Luke leaves us at the end of chapter 23. With a sealed tomb, with a silent Sabbath, and a group of grieving followers who fully expect death has the final word. But that silence doesn't last forever. Luke says, on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they'd prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. So the women are coming to complete the burial. They're not expecting a miracle. They bring spices to care for the body. And I want you to understand what that meant for them. These women, along with many others, believed that Jesus was the Messiah. They had followed him with the hope that he was the one God promised to redeem Israel. See, for generations, the Jewish people had been waiting for the Messiah, the promised king from the line of David, who would restore Israel, defeat her enemies, and establish God's kingdom. They expected a deliverer who would set things right in their nation and bring God's promise to fulfillment. So when Jesus died on the cross, it didn't just feel like they lost a teacher. It didn't just feel like they lost a friend. It felt like the future they believed God had promised had died with him. And now in their minds, they have a dead Messiah. Later in this same chapter, two disciples will say it plainly. They say, we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Notice the past tense there. We had hoped. Because as far as these women can see in this moment, hope itself has been buried. And we know these moments all too well, don't we? Moments when what we believed God was going to do doesn't happen. When we prayed for healing and the diagnosis didn't change. When we asked God to restore a relationship only to see the distance grow wider. Moments when the future we quietly planned collapses. When the plans we carefully built for our lives suddenly fall apart. Moments when life has carried us to places we never expected to stand. Moments when we find ourselves standing beside the bed of someone we love as we slowly see their strength fade away. Moments when we find ourselves standing at the graveside, realizing that their time on this earth has come to an end. Moments like that when we find ourselves standing in places where our hope seems to have been buried. And in those moments, it doesn't just feel like something ended, does it? It feels final. That's exactly where these women are, alive, but standing in the cemetery. Because their hope had a name, Jesus of Nazareth, friend, teacher, the one they believed was the promised Messiah, the one they believed would redeem Israel, and now they can't even find his body. Imagine it. You visit the grave of someone you personally saw laid to rest just days before, someone you love, someone you care about, you know exactly what happened there. You'd never expect to arrive and find that something has disturbed that place. That's the moment these women walked into. Luke says, but when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. At this point, there's confusion, there's shock, there's emotion. The tomb's open, the body's gone, it takes their breath away. Where is he? What happened to him? These questions are rolling through their mind. There's no category for what they're seeing or feeling. Luke says they were perplexed. It's about the only way you can describe it. They went to a place of certainty and found something that made no sense at all. And while they're trying to make sense of it, while they're still trying to process, suddenly something happens. It says, while they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men in dazzling apparel stood by them. As confusion sets in, heaven steps in. And their reaction is immediate. It says, and they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground. I mean, of course they're afraid. Nothing about this moment fits the world they live in. And the question these messengers ask cuts through all the confusion, all the emotion, and it cuts straight to the heart. They say, why do you seek the living among the dead? The New American Standard Bible captures the force of the question this way. It says, why do you seek the living one among the dead? See, these women came to a place that belongs to death, expecting to find Jesus there. But the angels remind them of something that had always been true. The one who gives life cannot remain in the place of death. See, from the beginning of his ministry, Jesus claimed something that no one else could claim, that life itself is found in him. Not just guidance, not just wisdom, not just comfort, life. And that's the good news this morning, friends, because that life is received by coming to him in faith, trusting that his death paid the price for your sin, and believing that the one who walked out of the grave that morning now has the power to give life to all that come to him. So the angels declare, he is not here, but has risen. And that changes everything. Maybe some of you are asking right now, why? Why does that change everything? I'll tell you. Because Jesus didn't just die. He died for sin. He took the judgment we deserved. He stood in our place. He paid a debt we could never pay. And when he walked out of that grave, when he rose to life, it was proof that that payment was accepted, which means forgiveness is not something you earn. It's already been paid for. It's something you receive by simply asking for it. The scripture says all that call on the name of the Lord will be saved. And that, friends, changes everything, because sin is the reason that we all die. And the grief that these women carried to the tomb that day is the same kind of grief that we all carry, not just in death, but in all the ways life reminds us of the things in this world and how they're not the way they are supposed to be. And that grief always feels heavier when we live as though Jesus died and forget that he rose again. And the resurrection changes that, because the death is not the end and the stone is not final. And the angels speak directly into that grief. They tell us how to deal with it. They say, remember. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise. And you know what it says in the very next verse? It says, and they remembered his words. The women had come to the tomb overwhelmed by confusion, by emotion, by grief. But when they remembered, the pieces began to fall into place. Jesus told them that this would happen. In Luke 9, he says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And again in 18, he said, they will kill him, and on the third day he will rise. And now, standing in front of the empty tombs, the angels remind them of those very words. They say, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the third day rise. And suddenly, those words make sense. See, the resurrection didn't introduce a new promise. It fulfilled the promise Jesus had already made. And once they remembered the words of Jesus, we immediately see a reaction. Sometimes in life, what shakes us the most is not just loss. It's realizing that the way we thought God would work was never what he actually promised. Luke says, and they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and all the rest. I want you to see the sequence here. They remembered, they returned, the response is immediate. Because when the truth of Christ is fully settled in your heart, it produces a response. Real faith can't sit still. It moves. There are moments when confusion overwhelms us, moments when circumstances seem to contradict what we believe about God. But it's often in those very moments that the words of Christ come flooding back to us and steady our hearts. Words like, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Or, because I live, you also shall live. And suddenly we remember that our hope was never meant to rest in our expectations about the future, about how we thought life would unfold, not about the plans we quietly assumed God would fulfill, not about the outcomes we believed would make everything turn out just right. Because if our hope is tied to those things, then when those things fall apart, our hope falls with them. That's why we have to keep coming back to what is true. And it begins with the resurrection. The resurrection reminds us that our hope was never anchored in our circumstances. It's anchored in a person. And that person walked out of the grave. Our hope rests in the promises of a risen Christ. So now with their hope anchored, these women return to the 11. It says, and returning to the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and all the rest. Luke tells us who these women were. He says, now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. These are real women, real eyewitnesses who had seen the empty tomb. And the fact that these first witnesses are women is one of those details that actually strengthens the credibility of the account. They came to the tomb expecting death, but they leave the cemetery now carrying the first announcement of hope, that Jesus is alive. But when they bring that message back to the others, the response isn't what we might expect, is it? It says, but these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. To them, the report sounded impossible. It sounded like the kind of story that people tell themselves when they're overwhelmed by grief. I mean, think about it. These women had just watched Jesus die. They'd seen his body taken down from the cross. They'd seen him laid in a tomb. They'd placed their future in him. So when they returned talking about angels and an empty tomb, it'd be easy to assume that grief was clouding their judgment. Maybe they misunderstood what they saw. Maybe sorrow was playing tricks on their minds. In other words, to the apostles, it seemed like an idle tale, the kind of thing people say when they desperately want something to be true. And let's be honest, there might be some listening here today that the resurrection can sound just the same way, too extraordinary, too unbelievable, like an idle tale. But although the apostles first dismissed that report, Peter still felt the need to investigate the claim himself. It says, but Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what happened. He didn't simply just shrug his shoulders and dismiss what he heard. He went to see for himself. Luke says he stooped down and looked in and saw the linen clothes there, and he went home marveling. Across the resurrection accounts, the gospel writers use different words to describe what happens in this very moment. There's a progression. First, people look, they examine, and eventually they understand. The reason we don't see this is because in the English, we use one word to translate three actions. It's the word look. But in the original, there's a progression. Seeing, blepo, considering, thero, to understanding what it means, hero. And that's exactly what happens with Peter here. He looks in the tomb, he investigates, he goes home marveling. The fact that this is exactly why Luke wrote his gospel in the first place. At the very beginning of this book, Luke tells us that he carefully investigated everything so that Theophilus, the man he's writing it to, might know the certainty of the things he'd been taught. And John, in the series we're studying right now, says a very similar thing at the end of his gospel. These things are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. In other words, the resurrection is not simply a comforting idea. It's an historical claim that invites investigation. And I want you to know that that invitation still stands today, because the truth is many people today are still standing where those women first stood, alive, but in places where their hope feels buried. But the message of Easter is this: what looked like the end was not the end. The stone was rolled away, the tomb was empty, but he is risen. Say it with me. He is risen. He's risen indeed. And because Christ rose from the dead, hope is never finally buried for those who belong to him. And that's why Easter changes everything. So let me ask you, have you done more than simply glance at the empty tomb from a distance? Have you examined the claim for yourself? Have you asked yourself, what if the resurrection actually happened? And if it did, what does that mean about Jesus? What does that mean about your sin? What does that mean about where your hope truly rests? What does the resurrection mean for you? Because at some point, it's not enough to only examine the evidence. The question that you have to answer is, do I believe this?